Well, hello there, it's Andrew here yet again. And today we're at episode 196. This one may be a little bit contentious. Well, it is what it is. We're looking at Matthew chapter 27, the first two verses. We're continuing with the treatment of Jesus, the trial, and the events that surround him, and this is just two verses. When morning came, now this is following his trial before the religious leaders. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. We're faced here with the reality that the chief priests and the elders of the people, the Sanhedrin, did not have the authority to effect the death penalty. Sure, they could pass one, they just couldn't carry it out. In Israel at the time, the authority rested with the civil and military powers ultimately under the authority of Rome. So it's off to the Roman governor, who does have the power to command a death sentence, that they go. Under the Torah, the law given through Moses, there are numerous crimes that will justify execution. They seem to relate mostly to the holiness code, how people worship, and to issues of sexual morality or of significant injustice and violence, such as murder. Yet the issue here seems to be more one of politics. It has a very contemporary ring to it. It's a wee bit like the case of Thomas a Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury under King Henry II, who had Becket assassinated when he found that he could not bend him to his will. Hence that famous phrase, "Who will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" And here we have in Jesus one who is troublesome, or certainly in their understanding, to the religious leaders. And they were willing to use the temporal powers, the power of the state, to do their dirty work for them. The price was high. It forever undermined their ultimate authority as the guardians of the way of God. In the 21st century, we also need to be careful that we are not co-opted by those very temporal powers that we think we are using. Who is really using who can very much become the question. My father used to have a number of sayings. One of them was that if you would sup with the devil, be sure that you have a long spoon. Part of the difficulty is that when we take a single issue, and we've had a number of them in our last election cycle, and treat it as the only thing that matters. Now, this hasn't been one that it has actually been a bit alive, but not as it has in the States, is the issue of abortion. The US provides a very good case in point. 81% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. My imagining is that he would have had a similar, if not higher, number in this election that has just passed. And the key issue? Abortion. It comes down to abortion. Abortion is a serious matter. I wish it never happened. I also wish that it was not a choice that women felt that they had no option but to make. There is a big difference between being pro-life and pro-birth. Greg Boyd, in his book The Myth of a Christian Nation, points this out. He suggests that if Christians in the US were truly pro-life, every time that a young woman lined up for an abortion, there would be a Christian family who would be willing to support her through the birth and provide the financial, material and emotional support to make sure that the woman and her child had everything they needed to give the child the best start in life, and to support her and her child as the child grew toward adulthood. Think about that for a moment. He's talking about being truly pro-life. He suggests that unless we're willing to do this, we can hardly be described as pro-life. So often the emphasis is on getting the baby born, then expecting the mother to succeed on her own and condemning her when she fails, and the child ultimately fails. Because in that society she truly is on her own. She might make it, but it's a recipe for setting her up and her child for failure. Still, we rescued them, didn't we? It also fails to recognise that in the US, legal abortions have been available since 1972. It's nearly 50 years. That's a big genie that's going to be very difficult to stuff back into the bottle. Better surely to work to ensure that abortion was no longer necessary. The other more just and life-giving options are available. Unfortunately, in the American mind, it seems that we see the kind of words spoken here by Christians that looks too much like socialism. Amazing. We see the same thing here, don't we? Socialism. That's what we're accused of. And this is where the Christians have been co-opted, I want to suggest, by the political powers, by, in their case, the Republican Party. There's a belief that if the Republican Party had all three chambers, the House of Representatives, the Senate and the Presidency, they could overturn Roe versus Wade, the abortion law. Well, they have had all three a number of times since 1972, yet somehow never seem to have gotten around to revoking Roe versus Wade. The promise is held out, but never actually delivered on, and I'm certain it's always someone else's fault that made it impossible to do it. Part of the problem is that they know that revoking Roe versus Wade without putting in a real commitment to social infrastructure will simply see a return to the days of desperate women seeking backstreet abortions with all the attendant complications. Few lives, if any, will be saved. What I'm seeking to point out here is that we need to be careful when we seek to co-opt the temporal powers. We could find that the temporal powers are actually co-opting us. I believe that this has happened in the US. Evangelical Christians may feel that they have won this one, having, under Trump, in a most despicable way, I think a dishonourable way, now secured a 6-3 Conservative majority on the Supreme Court, which is charged with interpreting the Constitution and its laws. I'd be surprised, though, if the court actually revoked Roe versus Wade as unconstitutional. They will recognise that the level of social disruption this will cause, and they'll pass on it, almost certain of it. And the evangelical church will pay a high price for the last 4 years. As people turn away from Christian faith, seeing it as hateful, bigoted, and populated by crazies. You've just got to go on YouTube and you can see some of them and you think, I want no part of that. Because that's what it looks like. In our narrative, as the religious leaders turn to temporal powers to deal with Jesus, they fail to see the high price they will pay. How could they? Yet they ultimately do, down through the centuries, ironically at the hands of the Christian church, who labelled the Jews as Christ killers. Unspeakable persecutions happened down through the centuries that followed. Nobody wins. So where does this leave us? Cautious. As Christians, we need to be involved politically. We need to stand for justice, especially for the most vulnerable. And who are more vulnerable than the unborn? Clearly nobody. Yet we also need to see what the deeper issues are of injustice in the grossly unequal distribution of resources. We need to see that there's a need for equal opportunities for all to good health care, to meaningful employment, to adequate housing. And the list just goes on. These are all actually moral issues. Yet so many of us simply hold our noses when it comes to these things and instead will seek to blame the victims of injustice. Remember, the system that we have is set up to keep those in power and prosperity in the positions to which they become accustomed. And sadly, that includes the church, including in Jesus' time. It may not have been very uplifting, but I hope it gives you something to think about. You may disagree with me. You may disagree with me totally, and that's absolutely okay. I really don't mind. It's a good thing, because I could be wrong. I certainly could. We do need to think about these things, though, to give them deeper thought and reflection, and seek to fashion a truly Christian, Christ-like response to the issues of our own day. God bless you.